The atrium of the Merrick Grand went still the way a room only goes still when the one person everyone is trained to watch decides to do something nobody put on the schedule. It was 6:12 on a Tuesday evening in late February, and Chicago, outside the tall glass, was the color of wet slate. The day was winding down the way it always did. Front desk staff counting out drawers, the concierge shrugging into his coat, a bellman wheeling the last luggage cart toward the service corridor, two account managers from the 14th floor heading for the revolving door with their collars up against the cold. Ordinary. The kind of Tuesday that leaves no fingerprint on your memory. Until Sloane Merrick came off the executive elevator. She was a presence before she was a person, if that makes sense. 41 years old, not tall, but she wore the room the way other people wear a coat. She had taken Merrick hospitality from a single tired hotel her father nearly lost in the recession to a chain of 11 properties across 4 states, and she had done it in 9 years, and everyone in that building knew it the way you know the weather. People straightened when she passed. Elevators seemed to arrive faster. She moved now across the marble, past the reception desk, past a duty manager, who went suddenly very upright, and walked directly toward a man in a charcoal maintenance uniform crouched by the east wall, coaxing a stubborn access panel back onto its housing with the flat of a putty knife. He looked up, surprised. There was a smear of pipe dope on his forearm and a small brass line level hanging off his keychain that caught the overhead light when he stood. Sloane Merrick stopped about 3 feet in front of him, and the whole atrium held its breath. Her voice wasn't quite level. Her words were. "I don't have a husband," she said, "so I was wondering, would you have dinner with me?" The little level swung once on his keys and went still. Nobody moved. Nobody exhaled. And not one soul in that atrium, not the duty manager, not the 2 account managers who had frozen halfway to the door, not the concierge with one arm still in his coat, had any idea that a question that small was about to reroute 2 whole lives. Now, before we go any further, do me a favor and drop a note where you're listening from tonight. I like knowing who's in the room for a story like this one. Go on. I'll wait. All right, let's go back to where it actually started, because it did not start with a question in a lobby. It started with a storm. Isaiah Bell had built himself a life that worked. Not a life that turned heads at a reunion, not a life anybody envied on a phone screen. A life that worked, warm, steady, put together the careful way a man puts a thing together when he cannot afford for it to fall apart. He was 39, and he was raising a 7-year-old girl by himself on a building engineer's salary in a city that found a new way to get expensive every single winter. He was good at what he did, and not in the loud way. He was good in the quiet way, the way that comes from actually caring whether the systems in your keeping run clean. Whether the boiler on the sublevel is holding pressure, whether the fire dampers are seated, whether the heat exchanger somebody logged as inspected really got looked at. Isaiah moved through the Merrick Grand the way water moves through a house. Everywhere, essential, noticed only when something stops flowing. At 39, he'd made his peace with a version of his life that a younger Isaiah might have called settling. He knew it wasn't. He knew exactly what it was. It was choosing Nia. Nia Bell, 7 years old, with her mother's stubborn jaw and her father's habit of narrating her own life out loud as she lived it. She'd started 2nd grade that fall and was already lobbying, with real conviction, to run the class weather station single-handed. Her teacher had written Isaiah a note describing Nia as enthusiastic and, at times, a leader of strong opinions, which was about the most diplomatic thing anyone had ever managed to say about his daughter, and he'd read it twice and grinned both times. Simone had been gone 2.5 years. An aneurysm, no warning, no fairness in it. She was 34, laughing at something on the radio while she braided Nia's hair, and then she was on the kitchen floor, and Isaiah was on the phone with the dispatcher, and by the time the ambulance made the corner, she was already somewhere he couldn't follow. She had given him the little level the first spring they were together, bought it off a folding table at a flea market in Pilsen for $2. She'd pressed it into his palm and said, "So you always know when something's true." He thought it was corny then. He thought about it a great deal now. The job at the Merrick Grand paid enough. Enough for the rent on the little 2-bedroom in Bronzeville. Enough for Nia's after-school program. Enough for the Friday night ritual of grilled cheese and tomato soup and 1 episode of whatever nature show she was obsessed with that month. It wasn't much. It was enough. And Isaiah had learned the hard way that enough, held with gratitude, is worth a great deal more than plenty held with a clenched fist. The guests at the Grand didn't see him much. He lived in the walls and the mechanical rooms of their comfortable lives. He was most visible when something broke, and on the 3rd Thursday of February a great deal broke at once. The storm came in off the lake with real intent. 40-mile-an-hour gusts, wet snow turning to ice on the transformer lines, and just after 9 at night, half the block lost power. The Grand's generators kicked in the way they were supposed to, but the older East Tower ran its heat off a boiler loop that did not love a sudden switch. And somewhere in that loop, a circulator pump failed, and the temperature in 90 guest rooms began very quietly to fall. Isaiah was already on shift. He'd stayed late on purpose, the forecast had told him to. He was in the sublevel when the pump alarm lit, and he did not run because there was no reason to run. Panic never fixed a pump. He pulled his kit, radioed the front desk, and worked the problem the way he worked every problem. Quick, calm, and already 3 steps down the road. It so happened that Sloane Merrick was in the building that night. She kept a suite on the top floor of the very hotel that carried her name, all clean lines and expensive quiet. And she'd been up there since 7 with a laptop and a glass of wine she wasn't really drinking, telling herself the silence was peace. When the heat began to sink, the duty manager called her, apologetic, and she came down. Not because she needed to, but because sitting still while her building struggled was a thing she had never once in her life been able to do. She found Isaiah at the boiler loop with the failed circulator in pieces on a shop rag, a work light clamped to a pipe, and a spare pump already halfway seated. "You're the engineer," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I am." He didn't look up from the coupling. "You're getting heat back in about 11 minutes. East Tower first, that's where the exposed rooms are. I already moved the 2 families with infants down to the south side where the loop never dropped." She blinked. "You moved guests. On your own. Front desk moved them. I told them which rooms and why." He torqued a fitting, checked it, torqued it a hair more. "The infants can't tell you they're cold." Seemed like the place to start. Sloane Merrick had spent 9 years being handed carefully worded explanations by people managing up at her. She was not used to a man on his knees in a mechanical room who had already solved the problem and simply told her the truth of it. "What failed?" she asked. "Circulator bearing went." He held up the ruined part like a piece of evidence. "It was flagged for replacement in the fall. Supply chain on the model we run pushed it back twice." A pause. "That's on me. I should have fabbed a workaround instead of waiting on the right part." She tilted her head. "Most people in your spot would have said the part failed, or the supplier failed." He finally looked up at her then, and there was nothing defensive in it. "It's my job to catch a bad part before it goes bad on a guest. It got past me." That's the honest version. He turned back to the loop. 11 minutes. He was right about the 11 minutes. He was right about the East Tower. She stood in that hot humming room longer than she had any reason to, watching a stranger do a hard thing well and take no credit for it. And something in her that had been frozen solid for a very long time shifted about 2 inches. The way furniture shifts, and suddenly a whole room looks different. "Thank you," she said when the heat came back up and the alarm went quiet. "What's your name?" "Isaiah Bell." He wiped his hands. "Building engineer." "Sloane Merrick," she said, which was entirely unnecessary, and they both knew it, but she said it anyway. "I know," he said, and there was the ghost of a smile in it, and he picked up his kit and went back into the walls of her building. She thought about him more than made any sense. Sloane was not a woman who indulged in examining her own mind. She was too busy for it and had trained herself out of the habit years back, when examining her own mind mostly turned up things she'd rather not look at. But in the days after the storm, she caught herself noticing Isaiah Bell around the property. Not in a way that felt like anything, just noticing. The unhurried way he crossed a floor with a tool bag over one shoulder. The way the rest of the maintenance crew talked to him. Not with deference, exactly, but with the easy trust of people who'd learned his read on things was worth having. The way he seemed to genuinely like his work, which was a quality she almost never met at any level of any company she'd ever run. She started, for no particular reason she'd admit to, reviewing the maintenance logs. She found the circulator he'd mentioned, flagged twice, delayed twice, every note thorough and dated. She found that he'd predicted nearly to the week when the bearing would let go. She pulled his file. Building engineer, level 2, 4 years tenure. Every review the same phrase, exceeds expectations. A commendation from the fire marshal after a small kitchen fire he'd contained before it reached the hood. And a note from HR 18 months back that stopped her cold. He'd been offered a facilities manager role and turned it down to keep a schedule that let him do school pickup. She read that last line twice. The next week, she found a reason to walk the East Tower service corridor at an hour she had no business being there, and told herself she was doing a property walkthrough, which she did do sometimes, which was true enough to hold up if anyone asked. He was reseating a damper when she came around the corner. He looked up without surprise, as if senior executive his corridors daily. "Ms. Merrick," he said. "Something wrong with the air up here? I do walkthroughs. I know." Just enough of a pause to suggest he wasn't entirely convinced this counted as one. The return on the East Zone's been reading a little low, nothing getting ahead of it. You do a lot of that. Getting ahead of things. Cheaper than cleaning up after. There was a beat she didn't quite know what to do with. "How long have you been here?" she asked. 4 years in April. Do you like it?" That small smile again, the one from the boiler room. "I like knowing things work because I showed up." He shrugged. "That's most of it." She nodded and kept walking and told herself again that it was a walkthrough. She saw him with his daughter on a Friday, and that was the thing that undid the last of the ice. It wasn't planned. She was leaving late, taking the parking structure to the second level where she kept her car, and the elevator opened onto a scene she wasn't braced for. Isaiah was crouched by an older pickup, a jack under the frame, working a lug nut that plainly did not want to come. And on the tailgate, wrapped in a bright red winter coat with her boots swinging free, sat a small girl with 2 puffball braids and enormous, appraising dark eyes, narrating the tire change in real time. "That one's being difficult," the girl observed. "It sure is," Isaiah agreed, not pausing. "Can I try?" "When your arms are longer. My arms are fine." She loaded more insult into 3 words than most grown adults manage in a paragraph. "Your arms are great, the bolt's the problem." Different issue. The girl weighed this with visible seriousness, tilting her head, and then she caught sight of Sloane by the elevator. Children do not run the same social software adults do. Nobody ever gives them the memo about pretending not to notice the most important person in the building. "Hey," the girl said, pointing. "You're the lady from the news." Isaiah looked up, his face cycled through surprise, then something private, then settled into that steady warmth. "Mrs. Merrick, flat tire. Nothing serious, just slow." He nodded at the girl. "This is Nia. She's supposed to be waiting inside. I wanted to watch," Nia said firmly. She wanted to watch, Isaiah confirmed, in the tone of a man reporting a negotiation he'd already lost. Sloane found herself standing there when she should have been walking to her car. "I didn't know you had a daughter," Isaiah said. He broke the lug nut loose at last, and Nia issued a small cheer from the tailgate. "You seem." Sloane stopped, started over. "You're easy about things, even this." She waved a hand at the flat, the cold garage, the Friday at 7 p.m. "Does anything actually get to you?" He sat back on his heels and gave the question real thought, which she wasn't used to. "Things get to me," he said. "I just try not to let them talk me into thinking they're bigger than they are. Nia needs me steady, so I practice steady. After a while, it stops being an act." Nia had slipped off the tailgate and was now inspecting Sloane with the frank, unhurried assessment of someone who has not yet learned that staring is rude. "Your coat is really nice," she said. "Is it real?" "Nia," Isaiah said. "It's all right." Sloane crouched down to the girl's level without deciding to. "It's real. It was a gift I bought myself, actually, when something good happened at work." Nia processed this. "My dad has a little thing on his keys," she offered. "It's for finding out if something's crooked. Mom gave it to him. He says it tells you when something's true." She looked up at her father. "Is Nia?" he said very still. "I'm just asking," Nia said, not sorry in the least. Sloane stood. She looked at Isaiah, who had, without seeming to decide to, closed one hand around the little brass level on his keys. He tucked it into his pocket when he caught her looking. "Have a good weekend, Ms. Merrick," he said. "You too," she said. She sat in her car for 3 whole minutes before she started the engine. She went home to the suite on the top floor. Floor to soiling glass, the whole cold sweep of the city laid out and lit up like something in a magazine. The kind of view that costs a fortune and impresses everyone and gives you exactly no warmth at all when you pour a glass of wine and sit down alone to the sound of your own breathing. She kept a wedding ring in the top drawer of her desk. Not out of sentiment, the opposite. She kept it as a reminder of what happens when you mistake someone's investment in your future for love of who you actually are. Preston Hale had been handsome and connected, and, for a while, the most convincing thing she'd ever been offered. She married him at 32. Sure, she was being both practical and romantic in equal measure. She learned at 35 that practical had been his entire strategy, that the man she'd thought understood her had been quietly cultivating 2 of her father's old board allies, positioning himself for a run at her chair. She'd caught it early, barely, and made him leave with nothing that was hers. The ring stayed in the drawer. Object lesson. This is what trust costs. But that night, Isaiah Bell's voice was in the room with her over the wine. "I just try not to let things talk me into thinking they're bigger than they are." And Nia's voice. "It tells you when something's true." And the way Isaiah had looked at his girl in that cold garage, not like a duty he was managing, but like the best thing that had ever happened to him, which is not a thing a person can fake at the end of a long week with a flat tire and no audience. Sloane sat with the wine and the silence and let herself feel, just for a minute, the full weight of the loneliness she'd been calling peace. It was heavier than she'd let herself know. She was surprised how heavy it was now that she'd stopped bracing against it. Over the next 3 weeks, she manufactured 4 reasons to cross Isaiah's path, and she knew exactly what she was doing, and she wasn't proud of it, and she did it anyway. She reported a draft in a conference room that turned out to be a propped fire door. She flagged a flickering light that had fixed itself by the time he arrived. She asked for a second opinion on a leak that turned out to be condensation off a beverage cart. Each time Isaiah handled it with courtesy and an expression of mild, patient skepticism he was too decent to say out loud. The 4th time, the lobby light that had stopped flickering before he ever got there, he set his bag down, looked at the perfectly ordinary fixture, and then looked at her. "The light's fine," he said. "I know," she said. "A beat. Okay," he said, and made a note in his log. "I wanted to ask you something," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. "About Nia. You said she's into weather, science. I'm putting together an apprenticeship fund through the company foundation. Trades, technical fields, kids from schools that don't have shop programs anymore. I could use a real perspective. Not the polished kind. That at least was true. The fund was real." Isaiah leaned against the wall, considering her. "With Nia, I mostly just let her break things and put them back together. Don't tell her something's too hard before she's tried it." A pause. "She's got a rain gauge on the fire escape she built out of a soda bottle. Flooded it twice figuring out the funnel. I just handed her paper towels." Sloane smiled. "High tolerance for mess. You kind of have to. The mess is the learning." The pause after that ran longer than she meant to let it. "You mentioned she likes tomato soup," Sloane said slowly. "There's a diner over on Halsted, the Blue Spoon. She'd probably—" She stopped. "I'm being strange about this." "A little," he said, not unkindly. She looked at him straight on. "I'm going to be less strange about it by the end of the week. If that's all right, I'll be here," Isaiah said, and picked up his bag and walked off. "So you know the rest of that Tuesday. The atrium, the marble, the whole day shift caught halfway to the door. She'd rehearsed it, in the elevator, in the shower, in the back of a car, and every version had been controlled and light and landed just right. And then she stood in front of him, and every version evaporated. And what came out was the plain, unarmored truth. "I don't have a husband," she said, and her voice wasn't steady. "I've been divorced 4 years, and for 4 years I've told myself that being alone was a choice I made out of strength. That's not entirely honest." She held his eyes. "Would you have dinner with me? You and Nia. The Blue Spoon, or wherever she'd rather. Somewhere easy. I want to know you outside of maintenance requests I made up." The atrium was silent now in a way no one had coordinated. 30-some people not pretending to be anywhere else. Isaiah stood very still, the little level turned over once in his hand. He looked at her a long moment, not with amusement, not with calculation, just reading something carefully before he answered. "You know what you just did," he said, "in front of your whole company. I know, and you're all right with that." "I'm terrified of it," she said. "I did it anyway." Something in his face moved then, quiet and irreversible, like the sun coming out from behind a cloud you'd stopped expecting to shift. "Nia has strong feelings about grilled cheese," he said. "She'll pick the diner apart and order it plain anyway." "I can work with that. Saturday," he said. 6 o'clock, the Blue Spoon. And then from behind him a small, clear voice. Nia had come to meet her father at the end of his shift and was standing at the edge of the marble in her red coat and her backpack, having watched the entire thing with the expression of a child who understands precisely what is going on. "Daddy," she announced across the whole atrium. "Is she going to be your friend? Because I think you should say yes. She looks a person right in the eyes." The room broke open. Real laughter, the kind that rolls through a crowd that's been holding its breath, 30-odd people cracking up at once. Isaiah turned to his daughter with the face of a man who loves someone past all dignity. "You're not helping," he told her. "I'm helping," Nia said. Sloane crossed the marble and crouched down in front of the girl, not thinking about it, just doing it. "I was hoping you'd approve." Nia studied her with those enormous dark eyes. "You made my dad smile in the garage," she said. "I saw it. He doesn't do that for regular people." And Sloane felt something crack open in her chest, not painfully, the way ice cracks in spring, the way water finds its level. Saturday was, by any honest measure, the best evening Sloane Merrick had spent in years. Nia interrogated the grilled cheese, ordered it plain, and explained the water cycle to Sloane using the fog on her soup as a demonstration. She asked 3 questions no adult would have dared. Do you have a dog? What's your favorite color? And don't say you don't have one because everybody has one. And why does your voice sound different than on the news? And waited for real answers. Sloane said, no dog, Forest Green, and I think I'm a little more nervous here than I am on the news. Nia weighed it. Good nervous or bad nervous? Good, Sloane said, and found she meant it. Isaiah was different outside the building. Not different in kind, the same steady warmth, just without the professional correctness the property put on him. He talked about Simone without hedging, which Sloane hadn't expected, named the loss as a part of the fabric of his life rather than a thing to protect her from. She'd have liked you, he said. She liked people with edges. Said edges meant you'd been through something. And people who built walls, Sloane asked. He turned walls and edges aren't the same. Edges let folks in. Walls keep them out. A pause. She was right about most things. Sloane was quiet a moment. I've been building walls. I know, he said. I don't think you need me to tell you that. No, she agreed. I think I needed somebody who wasn't scared of them. Now I'll tell you. A story this warm is exactly when the world tends to test it. Because the world does not love it when someone who's supposed to stay in her lane simply steps out of it in front of everybody. The item ran the following Tuesday in a business gossip blog called The Loop Ledger that covered the city's boardrooms with the breathless energy of a tabloid. Merrick CEO goes off script, bold move, or coming apart. The piece stayed technically inside the lines while implying that Sloane's interest in a maintenance worker was either a cry for help or a calculated stunt to soften a chief executive with a reputation for being unreachable. The comments were worse. They always are. But the part that required her full attention was the name in the 4th paragraph. Preston Hale had agreed to a brief comment. I wish Sloane every happiness, it read. She's always led with her heart. I hope she has the right people around her right now. He'd been on the board 6 months, a late addition she hadn't fully blocked because he'd come in on a shareholder resolution and she'd calculated that fighting it in public would cost more than managing him in private. She'd been wrong. Quiet, she was learning, is not the same as harmless. Sometimes quiet just means patient. Isaiah saw the piece before she could reach him. She drove down to Bronzeville after work with takeout on the passenger seat, and that particular dread in her stomach that comes from knowing a hard conversation is coming, and there's no way to skip it. He answered the door, looking like a man who'd been sitting with something difficult for hours. Nia's door was shut down the hall. He gestured to the couch and sat across from her, elbows on his knees. The blog got a lot of it wrong, Sloane said. I know. He picked up the level off the coffee table, turned it over. That's not what I'm sitting with. He waited a moment. 2 parents came up to Nia's teacher today, asking questions. One of them said it was concerning that a hotel CEO was involved with a 2nd grader's father. And the way she said involved, Ms. Okafor said, had quotation marks on it. He looked up. It's Nia 7. She doesn't understand why her dad's suddenly interesting to people who've never met him. Sloane felt the weight of that settle in her chest. I can't have her be collateral, Isaiah said. I need you to understand that's not up for negotiation. Not because, he stopped. Not because what's happening between us isn't real, it is. But she comes first, always. She should come first, Sloane said quietly. That's not an obstacle. That's who you are. Then you understand why I'm saying this might have to. No, Sloane said without heat. I understand why you're scared. I'm scared too. But I'm not going to let a gossip blog and a couple of nervous parents decide something that belongs to us. She leaned forward. And Preston's using this. That comment in the piece, that isn't goodwill. He has a board seat and he's been waiting for a moment to suggest I'm compromised. If I back off because of public pressure, I hand him the story. A breath. And more than that, Nia asked me on Saturday whether that little level tells you when something's true. And I've been turning that over for 4 days. I don't want to walk away from an answer I can actually feel. The room was quiet. You spent 4 years alone because someone hurt you, Isaiah said. Yes, and you spent 2.5 years careful because losing someone broke something in you that you're still rebuilding. He looked at the level. This isn't simple. No, she agreed. I'm not asking for simple. I'm asking for honest. From the hallway, a small voice. Dad? Nia appeared in her pajamas, sizing them both up with the specific attention of a child who's been listening and is deciding whether to intervene. Are you breaking up? We're talking, Isaiah said. It sounds like breaking up. She walked in and sat down on the couch beside Sloane, calm as anything, claiming the territory. I don't want you to, she said, straight to Sloane. You told me mean people don't get to decide. You said that in the garage. Sloan looked at Isaiah over the girl's head. He was watching his daughter with a face that had caved wide open. "Nia," he said, "go on back to bed after you say you're not breaking up." A long pause. Isaiah looked at Sloan. "First sign the attention is hurting her. First reels, we stop and we talk about it. Immediately," Sloan said. "You tell me and we adjust. That's a standing rule, not a one-time favor." He let out a long breath and turned the level over one last time. "Okay," he said, "we keep going." Nia stood, satisfied, and padded toward her room. At the door, she turned. "Sloan, you can stay for dinner. Dad was going to make grilled cheese." Isaiah closed his eyes for a second. "I would love grilled cheese," Sloan said. 6 weeks after the atrium, Preston Hale called a special session of the board. He framed it as a routine governance review. Sloan knew exactly what it was. She walked into that room on 4 hours of sleep and 7 hours of preparation. Warren Pike, her CFO, sat 3 chairs down with the posture of a man who has already picked a side and is only waiting for it to become safe to show which. Preston looked the way he always looked, thoughtful, moderate, calm. That was the trick of him. He wore consideration like a good suit, and none of it was connected to anything underneath. "Sloan, thank you for making the time. I run this company," she said. "I don't need to be thanked for coming to a board meeting." He smiled. "Of course. I only want to raise, as a concerned director, whether the recent public attention might benefit from some kind of statement. A clarification separating personal conduct from professional judgment." "There's no conduct to clarify," Sloan said. "I'm seeing someone who works in one of my buildings. He is not in my reporting chain. He supervises no one who reports to me. Not one professional decision I've made has been touched by it. What you're describing doesn't need a statement, Preston. It needs you to find a different angle. I'm only raising it out of concern for Preston." She said his name the way you set down something heavy. "You're raising it because you've been waiting 4 years for a door I closed to crack back open. I know what this is. The board knows what this is." She looked around the table, not at Warren Pike, but at the 3 independent directors who'd been there since long before Preston arrived. "I'm not going to perform a defense. My record is my defense." The vote, when it came, was 5-2 in her favor. The 2 were Preston and Warren Pike. She walked out of that room and texted Isaiah. 5-2. "The 2 of them are going to be very busy updating their resumes." He wrote back, "You okay?" She smiled at her phone in the elevator. "Better than I've been in a long time." "Grilled cheese tonight?" "I'll bring the soup." The months after that built something. Not fast and not smooth. It wasn't that kind of story. There were nights they couldn't see each other, days the coverage got tiresome, moments the distance between their 2 worlds needed real navigation and not just good intentions. But they navigated it. Sloan learned the shape of a Tuesday at Isaiah's place. Nia at the kitchen table doing homework. 40 minutes of theatrical resistance for every 14 minutes of actual help. Isaiah making coffee too strong and calling it a feature. Isaiah learned the shape of Sloan's world, not from the outside, but from close enough to see its cost. He came by her office once, unannounced, with 2 sandwiches, and found her at her desk at 7:30 surrounded by paper. So long alone in a room she'd stopped hearing the silence. He set the food on the corner of her desk without a word. "You don't have to check on me," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She held his eyes. "How do you know when something's worth the risk?" He sat down across from her and turned the little level over in his hands. "You don't," he said. "That's not really the question. The question is whether you can afford not to find out." She looked at it. "May I?" He held it out. She turned it in her palm, small, warm from his pocket. The bubble drifted and settled dead center. "Simone told you it tells you when something's true," she said. "She told me it tells you whether you're standing straight when you can't feel it yourself," Isaiah said. "You can be off level a long time and get used to the tilt. The tool doesn't care what you're used to. It just tells you the truth." Sloan set it on the desk between them. The bubble held center. "I've been redoing the foundation work," she said. "The apprenticeship fund, trades, technical training, kids from schools that cut their shop programs. I want to open the first 3 sites this year. I want your read on what actually works. Not the optics, the real thing." He looked at her carefully. "You're not asking because you need cover. I'm asking because I don't want to build one more phog that photographs well and helps no one," she said. "And you know the difference." He was quiet a moment. "Nia's school has 30 kids on a wait list for an after-school program they can't staff," he said. "Start there. Then we start there," Sloan said. 6 months after the atrium, on a Sunday morning in Isaiah's kitchen, which Sloan now had a key to, an event Nia had marked with a gift bag and a ribbon and a short speech, Nia was attempting pancakes. There was flour on her face and batter on the counter and firm opinions about the proper way to flip. Isaiah was supervising without taking over, which he'd once told Sloane was the single hardest part of the job. Sloane was pouring coffee and watching them and felt something settle in her chest she didn't right away have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Something under that. The plain rightness of being in the correct place. "Sloane," Nia said without turning from the stove. "Dad says you flip better than he does. He said that? He said you've got good technique." Nia glanced back over her shoulder with an expression so exactly her father's that Sloane nearly laughed out loud. "Will you show me?" Sloane set down her coffee and moved to the stove. She wrapped Nia's small fingers around the spatula and talked her through the timing, the angle, the confidence of the motion. The pancake turned clean, and Nia shrieked with a joy that rang off every wall in the kitchen. Isaiah caught Sloane's eye over his daughter's head, and his face was doing the thing she'd been learning to read. The look that meant he was wholly, quietly present in a moment that mattered to him. That afternoon, Nia was inside with a book, and the two of them sat on the back steps in the thin March light. "Preston resigned the board seat," Sloane said. "Announcements next week, you all right about it? He was a slow leak I should have fixed a year ago." She leaned her shoulder into his. "I'm fine. Nia's school breaks ground on the first site in April. We had families in for the planning session last week. One woman, single mom, 2 jobs, said the after-school program might finally let her take a certification course she's been trying to fit in for 2 years. She was quiet a beat. That felt like more than any quarterly report I've ever signed. "Because it is," Isaiah said. "Simple as that." She turned to look at him. "Do you ever miss it? The version of your life before all of it, when it was just you and the day in front of you?" He thought about it honestly, which she'd learned was the only way he ever answered. "No," he said. "I miss Simone. I'll always miss Simone. But I don't miss the man I was before Nia. That guy didn't know what he was capable of." He turned the level over in his hand. "Sometimes you have to lose the plan you thought you had before you find out what you were actually building toward." Sloane was quiet. Then from the doorway, Nia, pajamas on, apparently done declaring it afternoon and ready to call it evening on her own authority. She stood there with the look she got when she'd been working up to something. "Sloane," she said, "are you going to be ours? Like, for real?" Isaiah went very still beside her. Sloane looked at the girl. Small and certain in the doorway, the red coat on its hook behind her, a smear of dried pancake batter still on one cheek. "If your dad's all right with it," Sloane said carefully, "and if that's what you want. It's what I want." Nia's whole face did something that could only be called complete. She crossed the porch in 4 steps and threw herself into Sloane's arms. A full force, no breaks embrace that nearly took them both over sideways, and Isaiah steadied the two of them with the easy competence of a man who'd been doing exactly that his whole life. They stayed like that a while, the 3 of them. The little level in Isaiah's pocket, the bubble sitting true the way it always did, the way it always would. "I look people right in the eyes," Nia announced, muffled against Sloane's shoulder. "You really do," Sloane said. She looked at Isaiah over the girl's head, and Isaiah looked back at her with the expression she'd finally, after all this time, found the word for. It was trust, not the blind kind. Not the kind that happens to you in a lobby on a lucky night. The earned kind, the chosen everyday kind. The kind you build out of a failed pump on a cold night and a flat tire in a parking deck and a 7-year-old on a tailgate. Out of a lobby full of witnesses and a question that shook but held. They had built it. And they were still building the way you build anything meant to last, checking it as you go, making sure the thing stays true. And it did.